The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 4, Above the Veil. Chapter 9. The Free Folk Fortress, as Ebbet called it, lay on the far side of a deep chasm that went all the way down to the lava pools that the Chosen had tapped long ago for their complex heating systems of steam and hot water. As they approached the lip of the chasm, Mila could feel the heat rising up from the depths and could see the red glow. The only way across was a narrow, makeshift bridge that precariously spanned the 50-stretch gap. The basic structure of the bridge was two very narrow rails of the same golden metal as the rune ship, but all the planking and the handrails were made of crystal, metal, and scavenged material of all kinds that could easily be dismantled so that the bridge would be almost impossible to cross. Fortunately, it seemed solid enough as they crossed it, though Mila was careful to watch where she stepped, and not put any undue reliance on the handrails. She and Gil were carrying Tal between them, so it was a slow progress. Audris was carrying Adris, and complaining about it every 10 or 12 steps. Ebbet led the way in his own peculiar fashion, stopping every now and then to spin around, or suddenly crouch down, or just stop and stare into space. His main spirit shadow watched him indulgently, itself always regal and controlled. Across the chasm, they passed through a narrow, winding tunnel. Mila noted holes in the ceiling, useful for throwing stones or pouring hot liquid on intruders. With the chasm in this narrow way, the free folk were well defended, though Mila doubted any of it would be much use against determined Chosen with their spirit shadows and sunstone magic. Since Tal had never mentioned the free folk, she suspected that the Chosen either didn't know about the Underfolk rebels, or simply didn't care about them, as long as they didn't cause too much trouble. The narrow tunnel finally opened out into a vast cavern, easily 300 or 400 stretches in diameter and more than 100 stretches deep. A few old pinkish sunstones shone in the distant ceiling, creating an effect like an Inerian twilight. There were 6 or 7 fairly dumpy cottages arranged in a circle in the middle of the cavern, centered on a large open well, with clear water lapping over its sides into a gutter. A few buckets were stacked next to the well, and there was a pile of barrels, boxes, and other containers in a walled pen behind the houses. It didn't look like much. It certainly didn't look like a fortress. "The Fortress of the Free Folk," announced Ebbet with a grand gesture. "Or Temporary Digging Camp 14, as it was once known many cave roach lives ago." "Where do we take Tal?" Mila asked. The Chosen boy was heavy, and though she would never admit it, Mila was tired. "Oh, I suppose I can give him the antidote here as well as anywhere," said Ebbet. He took a small vial out of one of the deep pockets of his multi-layered robe, and added, "Just lay him down and support his head." "You have the antidote on you?" asked Mila. "You had it all the time? Why didn't you use it before?" "The poor boy clearly needed his rest," said Ebbet, looking down on his great-nephew. Mila shook her head. She knew there was no point in getting angry with Ebbet. He was like some of the older crones. His mind was traveling somewhere else where no ordinary Icecarl, or Chosen, could follow. She and Gil laid Tal down and then held up his head. Ebbet bent down and opened the sleeping boy's mouth with 2 fingers, poured in the contents of the vial, pinched Tal's nose, and said, "Shake him up and down a bit." Mila and Gil followed his instructions. Nothing happened at first. Then Tal coughed. The cough was followed by a sneeze, suffocated by Ebbet's nose-clasping fingers. Then Tal's eyes slowly opened. He was groggy, but after a minute or so, he could stand up on his own. At the same time, Adris came around and sat up, scratching his head.
"Why did you wake me up?"
he said aggrievedly to Audris.
"I was having such a good dream. I was shooting lightning at moths, and every time I hit one, they exploded with smoke and sparks."
Audris slapped him, shadow flesh meeting shadow flesh with a strange, rasping sound. "I thought you were dying," she said, "and you're worried about a stupid dream." "Or are we?" asked Tal. His voice was weak, and he felt terrible. He was sick in the stomach and shivery all over. "The Free Folk Fortress," said Ebbet. "The Cavern of the Free Folk," said Crow at the same time. "Call it by its proper name." He pushed past Ebbet and stalked off toward the largest of the cottages. Inky scuttled after him. Clovel and Ferric hesitated, then followed. Gil stayed behind. As Crow approached the cottage, the door opened and 2 grown men in the painted underfolk robes came out. One was quite old as Ebbet, but he was much shorter and quite shriveled and dried up looking. He had gray hair, cut so short it was a stubble. The other man was about the same age as Tal's father, Rerum, though he was much brawnier. He looked like the sort of underfolk who did the heavy carrying around the castle. His chest and upper body were easily twice the size of Tal's. His hair was black and long. As Tal looked at the younger man, he realized he had to be related to Crow, and might even be his father. There was a strong facial resemblance, and though Crow was not physically as big yet, there was every indication he would be one day. Crow raised his hand in a formal-looking salute, but only the older man waved back. Tal was surprised to see Crow lean forward and hug his brawny relative, but the man did not hug him in return. "We have brought 4 prisoners," Crow said to the older man, loud enough for Tal and Mila to hear easily. 2 chosen and 2 spirit shadows. "I'm not a chosen," Mila declared, "and I'm not a prisoner." Tal didn't say anything. He didn't feel up to it. Besides, after his experience with the ice curls, he had started to think that silence was the best policy when meeting anyone new. "Neither am I," said Audrus. "And Adris isn't one either."
"One what?"
asked Adris. He was rubbing his stomach and hadn't been listening. "Prisoner! You're not a prisoner of anybody," said Audrus.
"Sure."
Adris looked across at Tal and said,
"Can you try to feel better? Your shadow is making me feel sick. It made me sleepy before."
"It's the spider bite," Tal explained. "So you were unconscious too?"
"And asleep,"
Adris answered.
"I fell over right after you did."
Crow and the other free folk were talking to the old men, but Tal didn't listen. He was too interested in what Adris had just said. "I wonder if this spider poison," he said aloud. Then he turned to Ebbet and said, "Uncle Ebbet, could my mother be ill because she's being poisoned with water spider venom?" Ebbet scratched his head and discovered a blue crayon that had somehow gotten tangled there. He looked at it in a puzzled way and said, "Yes, I hadn't thought of that. I don't know how you would get the venom out of the spider, but constant small doses would make her very sleepy, and if continued would force a coma. Yes, it explains the symptoms, but how to milk the spider? I suppose some sort of harness, and then a vacuum apparatus. Good thick gloves, a stick to whack the critter with." His voice trailed off into a mumble as he continued to think aloud. "Gref must have been poisoned too," said Tal. He was thinking furiously as he became more alert. Both his mother and Gref poisoned with water spider venom. Sushin must have access to the spiders. Perhaps he even had some tame ones somewhere. Tal shuddered at the thought of Sushin cuddling up with water spiders. But he was also suddenly hopeful. Now that he suspected what was being done to Grail and Gref, he could possibly get them the antidote. His thinking was interrupted by Crow shouting something and stalking off to one of the other cottages. He opened the door viciously, went through, and slammed it shut so hard that some rock dust fell from the distant ceiling of the cavern. The 2 men watched him go for a moment. Then the older man walked up to Tal, with the black-haired giant following him a pace behind. As they approached, Tal realized the leader looked familiar, though he had never seen him in the robes of an underfolk. That is, a free folk. "Greetings, Tal and Mila, Audrus and Adris," the man said. As Tal heard his deep, measured, vibrant voice, so out of place coming from the little body, he remembered where he'd seen him before. "I am called Jarnal, and I am the leader of the free folk," said the old man. Tal blinked. He knew this man by his full name. He was the Brilliance Jarnal Yano Kir of the Indigo Order, once Chief Lector. He had taught Tal when he was a little boy. He had also been dead for at least 5 years.